ultimately the IDF have significantly overcome Hamas. I think there's something like 350 Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza. They estimate that they've killed around 19,000 or more Hamas terrorists.
Has Hamas been destroyed since October 7th?
I would say Hamas has been defeated. Certainly its capability of doing serious damage to Israel, being a threat to Israel, has been defeated, even though on the 7th of October anniversary, they fired about 5 long-range missiles from Gaza towards Tel Aviv, which were all intercepted by the IDF. But that aside, they've been largely taken apart, and their military units have all been pretty much dismantled, which leaves them with small groups of individuals or small numbers of people who are still carrying out terrorist attacks and still have significant control over Gaza. But as an organization, they've been pretty much taken apart. So I think there's a lot of work to be done by the IDF still to finish the job, but it's certainly in sight now, in my view.
Can you explain what has happened in the last year from a military perspective? How have Israel defeated Hamas?
Well, they've done it by sheer military force, and that includes airstrikes against some of their main parts of their infrastructure, including headquarters, control centers, weapons sites, etc. They've also done it with infantry soldiers and tanks and artillery on the ground, again against similar targets, but targets that can best be reached by ground attack. Obviously, the best way of attacking an enemy in this situation is from the air, but you can't do the job wholly from that. And the other element that they've been extremely successful in is fighting in the tunnels. Those tunnels, massive structure of hundreds of miles, were not designed to fight in. They have not been produced to be able to defend very well. And the IDF have exploited that by sending specialist units and ordinary soldiers with specialist equipment, some of which has been developed since the war began. And they've really done an incredible job there. They've been fighting above ground, on the ground, and below ground in coordinated operations, which has enabled them to do very, very severe damage to Hamas. And of course, when you're fighting on the ground or above ground, the civilian population is a major problem, and you have to take special care to make sure that you do the maximum damage to Hamas, but the minimum damage to civilians. The IDF have done that. Below ground, there's only Hamas, which doesn't make fighting easy particularly, but at least it removes the problem of having to contend with human shields.
What does Gaza look like? You see a lot of images of just utter destruction from bombing and so on. Is that realistic? Is that the whole of Gaza? I don't know if you've been there, but what does Gaza look like at the moment?
I've been into Gaza several times with the IDF since the war began, and I've seen a lot of the devastation. There is a great deal of devastation and destruction. Not complete. There's still, I think, I can't be sure of my estimates, but I think something like 40% of Gaza has been demolished. That may not be the correct figure, but it's not a complete demolition of all the structures in Gaza. But I think there's been a lot of damage, a great deal of damage, and there's a good reason for it, and that's because a large number of buildings, whether they're civilian houses, hospitals, schools, mosques, but a very large number of buildings have weapons stored inside them. They're used by Hamas. They have tunnel entrances inside them and tunnel exits. And Hamas, I would say in some places I've seen, 2 out of every 3, in some cases 3 out of every 3 buildings have had weapons in. I've seen grenades under children's beds, rifles in kitchen cupboards, all of these things. And of course, many of them, probably the majority of them, have been heavily booby-trapped, so that the only way really to deal with Hamas's terrorists and infrastructure when they're in the buildings is not to try not to enter them and risk soldiers getting killed, but to hit them either with a tank shell or more tank shells, or hit them from the air. And that really does account for so much of the devastation.
And what has this meant for street fighting in Gaza? There was a lot of speculation that if you simply bomb a city and turn it into rubble, that creates a perfect situation for people to defend to sort of defend houses by houses, the street fighting we saw in places like Stalingrad and so on. Has it been difficult for the IDF to deal with this kind of sort of terrain?
Yeah, I mean, I think every soldier will tell you that the most difficult terrain to fight in is urban terrain, built-up areas, and that applies whether the buildings are standing or whether they've been demolished. And I don't think, I think in the ideal world, the IDF would not demolish the buildings because obviously that they if they don't need to, they wouldn't do it. It would be against the Geneva Convention to demolish civilian buildings without necessity. As you rightly say, fighting among rubberized areas can become more difficult. But at the same time, given the extensive preparations Hamas have made in Gaza, booby traps, mines, sniper positions, escape routes, and all of this, that becomes disrupted by the demolition of buildings. So it's in some ways it's a kind of mixed blessing for the IDF, but it's, I think, from everything I've seen, it's been unavoidable.
So was it the case that Hamas had essentially turned Gaza into a prepared war zone before October 7th, predicting that the IDF would invade? So you talk about the booby traps and so on. To what extent had Hamas prepared for a war before October 7th?
They prepared very, very extensively. They expected the IDF to attack, and they knew that the IDF would have to attack after what they were planning and did on the 7th of October. And they did the most extraordinary preparations. The tunnel system alone speaks for itself. Hundreds of miles of tunnels, some of which have heavy blast doors inside to make it more difficult to fight in. They're interconnecting in many cases. They provide positions for not just for movement of Hamas terrorists and their weaponry, etc., but also for ambush positions. Some tunnels will branch out into a number of places where Hamas can kind of pop up either in front of or behind IDF advancing troops and ambush them from there. And even things like roads, you've seen probably imagery of IDF bulldozers churning up roads. And this is not just to destroy roads. This is has a specific purpose, which is to defeat landmines and explosives that have been concealed under the road, beneath the tarmac on the roads. And that's the complexity of all this has been, I think, extremely tough and accounts for quite a lot of the IDF casualties we've seen. But ultimately, the IDF have significantly overcome Hamas. It's been, I think there's something like 350 Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza since the war began. Around that number, it may be a few more or less now. And they estimate that they've killed around 19,000 or more Hamas terrorists, which is an extraordinary ratio. Yes, the IDF are much better equipped, far greater firepower than Hamas, but normally, irrespective of the capabilities of forces, in a defensive operation, the defenders tend to be have greater strength and power than the attackers, and so you'd expect to see the reverse of the figures that I've just mentioned.
What kind of war does this remind you of in history? Did Hamas expect this to be like a Vietnam for the IDF, using these tactics that maybe are reminiscent of the Viet Cong? Are there any other kind of wars that you would compare this one to? And to what extent is the Israeli victory, or it sounds like you're calling it a victory, to what extent has that victory been kind of one-sided? You talk about 350 casualties versus 19,000. That sounds like a complete wipeout for the IDF.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard to compare this to any other war. There's never been a battlefield quite like it. I think it's the most complex battlefield that any armed forces had to fight on. And that's partly because of the extensive preparation Hamas made that I mentioned already, partly because of the fact that it's in a built-up area, which is very tough to fight in, partly because of these underground tunnels, partly because of the hostages that were being held and still are being held inside Gaza, which make fighting that much more difficult. So I'm not aware of any other conflict that's had all of those elements. in one place. Some of them in some different places. But for example, I was in Ukraine just before this war began, and I visited several times Ukrainian battlefronts. Much more intense, far heavier casualties on both sides, but nothing like as complex. And I think Hamas, when you say Hamas, did Hamas expect this to be the IDF's Vietnam? I think that Hamas expected Israel would get bogged down, would not achieve anything like it's achieved now, and probably most importantly, would be stopped by the international community before it achieved victory over Hamas. And of course, that's one of the reasons why they use human shields, why they fight from within civilian populations, and why they, while the IDF are doing everything they can to minimize civilian deaths, Hamas are doing everything they can to maximize deaths of their own civilians, so that international pressure comes on Israel to stop them fighting, because stopping Israel fighting is pretty much the only way they've got of surviving, and they knew that at the beginning. And as to whether it's basically a walkover for the IDF, I wouldn't put it in quite those terms, because the fighting has been tough. Some of the terrorists they've been fighting have been very resilient, very determined, and have stood their ground. And as I mentioned before, they've made extensive, very sophisticated preparations, like, for example, booby traps, whether it's in tunnels, in houses, or in open ground, which are covered by cameras so that they can be remotely detonated when an IDF soldier passes, or IDF soldiers pass by the explosives. So it's been tough fighting for the IDF. There's no question about that. And I don't think any IDF soldier, certainly none that I've met, would class it as a walkover. But by and large, whenever they've been confronted by Hamas, or Hamas have confronted them, there's been no question as to the outcome. The Hamas terrorists are going to die, and if they don't die, they're going to run away, and if they don't run away, they're going to surrender.
How has the guerrilla fighting impacted the IDF's morale? One would assume that because of the terrible atrocities on October 7th, that's an incredible motivating factor to go and essentially kill these terrorists who have murdered innocent civilians. But at the same time, we know that we've seen from previous wars, like I mentioned in Vietnam, maybe even in the Napoleonic Wars in Spain, where this term guerrilla was invented, it really took a toll on the attackers' morale. Can you assess the impact of this kind of guerrilla fighting?
I think the effect on morale has been the opposite. I've spoken to many IDF soldiers. I've seen them in action in Gaza, as I mentioned. I've spoken to them outside Gaza, and the morale is remarkably high. Far higher than in my experience you get from British, American, other soldiers who are fighting in maybe similar, not totally similar, but same kind of circumstances. And one of the reasons for that is because, as you said before, the extent of the Hamas atrocities is a real motivating factor. They all know what happened on the 7th of October last year. And then equally importantly, perhaps more importantly, unlike British and American troops in recent years who have fought thousands of miles away from home, these people are fighting on their own back doors. They're literally fighting, a few miles away from where their families, their friends, their countrymen are living. And that, I think, gives even greater incentive to endure what's very tough circumstances. And it's not just the fighting that's tough, but also you see your friend with his leg blown off next to you, or you see your other friend on the other side getting killed. That takes a toll on anyone. But I just have nothing but admiration, I have to say, for the resilience of the IDF and the extraordinary morale that they've managed to maintain.
There has been, as you mentioned, terrible numbers of civilian casualties in the fighting in the last year. And this has caused a major backlash internationally. Most countries around the world have expressed horror at the numbers of civilians who've been killed in Gaza. And, I've seen it here in America. I've spoken to Muslims in Detroit who tell me, that members of their family have been killed. Innocent people Palestinians in Gaza have been killed during the fighting by the IDF. What do you say to people who say, well, actually, the IDF have gone far too heavy in their fighting. They haven't thought enough about civilian casualties, and basically they've gone too far. We've even seen Israeli IDF whistleblowers pointing out in some instances where civilians have been killed unnecessarily, things like attacking aid workers and mistakes like that. What do you say to these accusations? Basically, the IDF has been too heavy-handed and has killed far too many civilians.
I think the extent of civilian deaths, or even any deaths in Gaza, is horrific, and nobody wants that. And least of all, the IDF wanted civilian deaths in Gaza. This wasn't an act of revenge. This was an act of defense of their own people after an invasion by a terror army, which had every intent, and their leaders have said it repeatedly since the 7th of October, which had every intent of doing the same thing again if they could. So I think, having said all that, the IDF have gone, I think, above and beyond what any other army that I know of have ever gone to minimize civilian deaths. They've dropped millions of leaflets on areas that they're planning to attack. They have made millions of voice messages, text messages, phone calls, and other communication means to warn people to leave. They've dropped maps showing where the dangers are, where the best routes out are, and where the safer areas are. They've done all of this. They've aborted 50% of the planned airstrikes they intended to carry out against terrorist targets in Gaza. They've aborted half of them when they realized that there are civilians in the target area. So the measures they've taken, I think, have been extraordinary, and other armies have been and will be learning from the IDF. But of course, you speak about unnecessary civilian deaths. There have been, I'm sure there have been cases of civilians being killed when they shouldn't have been, and that unfortunately happens in war. It happened in Afghanistan, it happened in Iraq, it happened in the First and Second World War. It happens in all wars. Soldiers make mistakes. Some soldiers are bad soldiers who will do things that they shouldn't do. And in the IDF, like in the British Army, when that is identified, when those kind of crimes are identified, then they're investigated, and the soldiers concerned are subject to disciplinary action, military courts. And of course, technical errors occur as well. If you want a bomb to go to a particular area, it doesn't necessarily go there. It might go somewhere else. I think that's relatively a small prospect given the technological sophistication of the IDF. But it does happen, and these things do happen. And I think the other thing we shouldn't overlook is the fact that Hamas have deliberately murdered many of their own people. They have also fired about 1/3, I think, of the rockets they fired out of Gaza have landed inside Gaza by mistake, which have killed a lot of people as well. So the total number of deaths, most of them are probably, I would say without a doubt, down to the IDF, but a quite large number are also down to Hamas themselves. And in reality, you have to say, or I have to say anyway, that every death in Gaza since October last year is the responsibility of Hamas. If Hamas hadn't invaded Israel, none of these deaths would have occurred.
What about this accusation that Israel is committing a genocide against Palestine? Again, this has become a very popular term used to describe what Israel has done in the last year. I've heard it many, many times here in America. You go to protests and people are chanting, this is a genocide against the Palestinians. Is that, can you just assess that accusation? Obviously, you've been on the ground in Israel. Have you seen anything approaching that?
That accusation, I believe, is an obscenity. And as I mentioned before, I've seen IDF soldiers in action. I've spoken to many IDF soldiers. The very idea that they would be or are committing genocide is 100% wrong. The reality is that it's Hamas which has been attempting genocide. Hamas's charter calls for the genocide of Israelis and Jews everywhere. It also, the words of their leaders continually re-emphasize that. And the actions of the Hamas terrorist army on the 7th of October confirm it. They killed every Jew they could find once they got into Israel. That is something more closely approaching genocide than anything the IDF has done. They're not going to commit genocide because they don't have the power to do so. But a lot of a lot of the kind of surroundings of genocide are intent. Certainly, it's not Israel's intent to commit genocide, and certainly it is Hamas's intent to commit genocide.
Why do you think that Israel has lost the support of so many international allies and bodies after October 7th? There's been a lot of criticism of Israel from countries like France, Britain, America, the leaders of those countries on the world stage. Why do you think Israel has lost that kind of moral high ground?
I don't believe Israel has lost the moral high ground here, and the US in particular has been very, very strong in its support of Israel. Britain also has played its role, as has France. And all we have to think about is, apart from the supply of munitions and aircraft and other military equipment from the US in particular, apart from that, Britain, the US, France, and some Arab countries, including Jordan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, have actively taken part in the defense of Israel against missile attacks from Iran. But I understand what you're saying, really, that there has been some quite intensive criticism of Israel. There's been intense criticism of Israel from places that we would expect it from, like the United Nations and some of the so-called humanitarian organizations, which have had a long-term anti-Israel agenda. But I think the reason why we've seen such extensive criticism among what should be Israel's unshakable allies is that they are determined, US, Britain, other European countries, are determined to appease the elements of their electorates, which are very noisy and very loud, and which protest almost daily, or certainly weekly, on the streets of our cities and in the universities, etc. They want to appease them, and the only way to appease them is to criticize Israel. The leaders of these countries know, because they're briefed extensively, and they understand the reality of what's going on. They know that their criticisms are unfounded, but they feel they have to do it. And the other element is that they are desperate, the US in particular, to appease Iran. And criticizing Israel is a way of appeasing Iran.
And just finally, obviously this is a year from the October 7th attacks. How did these attacks happen? How did the IDF, the intelligence services in Israel, let this happen? This is a massive failure. Has there been introspection? Has there been investigations? Has there been, people taken responsibility for what's happened in the last year? How do you assess the kind of retrospective investigations into what happened in October 7th? Can you just talk a bit about how the Israelis have reacted?
Yeah, I mean, I've been here for most of the time since the 7th, or since the 9th of October, in fact. I've been in and out a few times, but I've been in Israel for a lot of the time since then. And I've had the opportunity to speak to many Israelis about this. And there's no question, everybody knows this was an utter devastating failure. I don't think it surprised anyone in Israel that Hamas wanted, or very few people anyway, that Hamas wanted to wreak destruction and devastation and murder on Israelis. That's never been a secret. I think the great surprise was that it was possible for them to do so, that the IDF failed so badly in their defense. And that's, the key, I would say the key and most important failure there is a failure of intelligence, in which the IDF intelligence organization and Shabak, the internal security organization, misappreciated Hamas's intent. And they did not believe that they were anywhere in the foreseeable future were going to carry out an attack of this nature. And that really influenced the way that the IDF defended against the enemy inside Gaza and reduced their guard to a significant degree. And the head of intelligence who presided over this failure resigned a short while ago. And there certainly have been a lot of introspection, a lot of investigations taking place. And I've spoken to IDF commanders who, senior IDF commanders who have, they're still in the fight, they're still commanding, they're still doing the jobs they were doing on the 7th of October in many cases. They've openly said, I failed on that day. and I'm going to fight and play my role in destroying this organization, and then that's it for me. So I think a lot of people recognize exactly what happened. One point I would make, though, when we talk about this failure, is on the 7th of October, we saw terrible failure, but we also saw, I think, the most extraordinary courage and heroism from individuals, particularly on the ground, where there were civilians, policemen, soldiers, many people, many Israelis just grabbed a rifle and went to the aid of their fellow countrymen who were under attack. And there's some extraordinary heroism. We shouldn't, I don't think, forget that when we condemn the IDF and Israeli intelligence for their failures.